before we get started, we just want to thank you all for your participation today. The call will be recorded and posted to our YouTube page. If you have any questions on the call today, please speak up. And a reminder, as an FCA member, you can call your FCA safety phone line where you can have your questions answered by another safety professional. Dial 844-414-SAFE or email us at safetyhelpline@finishingcontractors.org. And with that, I'll pass it over to our safety professional, Mike Hartnett.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the monthly safety call for FCA members. I'm glad to talk today about ladders, bakers, and stilts. This is an issue that is of much importance to finishing contractors. And then we'll finish with a focus on hard hats, answering questions on what are allowed and not allowed with hard hats. So with no further ado, let's get right into it. Why do we have to worry about having ladder usage, stilts, and bakers? Well, falls are still our leading cause of unintentional death, right, occupationally. So we need to make sure that we're protecting our employees from that hazard. 43% of those fatal falls are ladder related. So considering the amount of time that is spent on ladders in the finishing trades, this becomes integral to your safety programs, right? In construction, 81% of serious falls are related to ladders. And you have a huge number of those falls annually. Right? 113 fatalities. Doesn't seem like too big of a number across the country, but realistically, that's a lot of impact on a lot of companies on an annual basis. And then we have 15,000, serious cases that cause days away from work. And then another 34,000 that are treated in the ER. So this is a company that's this is an issue that's going to be impactful for anybody in the finishing trades, right? Especially when you're considering the percentage of time your employees are spending on a ladder, right? Now, when I was in the field, I spent 15 years in IUPAT as a painter, and a lot of times I saw the 5-gallon ladder being used, and it's just not an acceptable option. Right? We need to make sure that we're providing proper ladders and that we're picking the right ladders. So the hazards that we have to deal with are our ladder choice, which can be very impactful, damaged equipment and how we provide that equipment and how we take care of that equipment when it's damaged, how our employees are setting up that equipment, right? Specifically looking at ascent and descent of that from that ladder, working once we get to that working height, and then electrical, which is another big hazard related to ladders. So we'll discuss all of those. First of all, ladder choice. Okay, ladder choice is hugely important. You have a vast range of different ladders that you can utilize for a bunch of different applications, right? And ladders are not a one-size-fits-all. The little giant on the bottom right, which articulates and allows you to put in a lot of different configurations, work really well in stairwells. That's where they really excel. But they're also extremely heavy, right? They're a lot heavier than your standard fiberglass ladder. So when we are going to utilize these for stairs, we can't just say, well, they have a little giant, they can get to everything. Right? Because carrying around that extra heavy ladder is something that may not be happening. And instead, we may choose other ladders. Make sure that when you have the proper ladders on site, right? An A-frame does not get everything. You can't get to everything with an A-frame. And if you're using an A-frame leaned up against the surface, you're using that A-frame incorrectly. When we have multiple different heights that are being reached, we should be offering, we should make sure that we have provided more than just one extension ladder, right? When there's a 40-footer on site, we can't be using that for all of our access, right? Because a 40-footer is very challenging to utilize. If we can have a 16-footer on the same job and give a selection of ladders, then our employees have the option to use the correct ladder in the right place. And also we can stop not utilizing the proper ladder at some times, right? Attachments on these ladders can be important. On the top right, self-leveling ladders such as this can be very useful. And then you have platform ladders that can be very useful when you're working at the same height throughout the job consistently all the way through. Using a platform ladder, like here on the top right, can really help lessen the strain and increase productivity. Right? And then chicken ladder for roofs is a possibility. It's also important that you look at your duty rating, right? I know we got some big painters out there. So at 250 or 300, we need to make sure we have that heavy duty, extra heavy duty, or special duty, right? This weight limit includes what material is being brought up, right? So if we're climbing a ladder and we're painting something and we have 2.5 gallons of paint that are about 10 gallons each, we got another 25 pounds there on top of the weight of the person. We can exceed those medium duty and light duty ladders pretty quickly. So make sure that you're taking into consideration not only the weight of the painter, but the weight of the equipment that's going up there with him as well. Okay, damaged equipment. Now, we all know that our employees are supposed to be inspecting their ladders prior to getting on those ladders. Okay, no argument there. That's something that needs to be done. That's something we need to enforce. But what I want to make sure that all of you are doing is when you bring the ladders back to the shop or they come off of a job, they need to be inspected before they're sent back out, right? Because if we send out ladders that are damaged, the employees are going to take that and say, well, this is what they sent. This is what they want us to use, right? And you lower the expectation for your employees when you send them damaged material to work with. So make sure that in between jobs, these ladders are making it back to the shop to get inspected. And when you do have damaged equipment, make sure that you tag it right away to mark it do not use. And ideally, you'll destroy the ladder instead of just throwing it in the dumpster. I've known many contractors run into a situation where they've thrown out a ladder and then later found it back on their job site, right? So destruction of ladders is a better way of disposing of ladders because your workers can take them out of the garbage and then use them on the job site, or maybe just bring them home to use them, which doesn't do you any good if they fall off of a ladder at home and then you're short a worker, right? Or get into work and try to claim it happened there. So we want to make sure that when we have those issues with ladders that we correct. OSHA has some resources you can utilize to share with your employees. They have a little fact sheet for how to reduce falls on step ladders, which can be useful, can be used as a toolbox talk to your employees on what the safe way of using a step ladder is. When it comes to that damaged equipment, OSHA has some very specific language spelled out for what they allow and don't, right? It starts out with the inspection. It's required a competent person performs that inspection prior to use, right? So free of visible defects and make sure that it's ready to utilize. If it is damaged, if you see damage during that inspection, it needs to be marked immediately. Right? You need to make sure it's taken out of service with a tag that says do not operate, out of service, or something of that nature. Make sure that you have those tags available at the job site and that you've trained your employees on what to look for and what to do with a ladder that is damaged. What we don't want our employees doing is using a ladder because that's the ladder they have, even though it's damaged, right? And you need to make sure that you have made that clear to your employees, that the expectation is not to use a damaged ladder, even when that's the only ladder you have, right? Even when it's the only ladder you have. If there are repairs that are going to be performed on a ladder, they need to return it to a condition that meets its original design criteria, right? So we can't duct tape, taping other things to it or bolting things to it isn't going to work. My suggestion is never shop repair a ladder. You should generally have a ladder from the manufacturer in the condition that they have it. Improper setup. This is pretty common out in the field. Step ladders, never use it in the folded position. I know as a first-year apprentice, I learned this the hard way. I rode down a cinder block wall with my forehead when leaning a A-frame ladder against the wall. I got road rash across my forehead and it used terribly by my foreman and the rest of the crew for the rest of that job. So it's pretty easy to have an A-frame ladder kick out when you're using it. So why do we use an A-frame ladder to lean against something instead of setting it up? I can tell you the reason that I used the A-frame ladder at that time when I hurt myself, because we had the choice between a 6-foot A-frame and a Widowmaker, a 40-foot extension ladder. And that 40-foot extension ladder hurt my back. I didn't like carrying it. So instead of setting that up to reach something that was 8 foot tall, I grabbed the 6-foot extension ladder. It was outside, so I couldn't set it up. I shouldn't extend it, so I leaned it against the wall, right? That's a pretty common exercise out there. We need to make sure that we provide the correct ladder choices for the jobs that we're doing, right? Make sure that we can reach the heights that we're supposed to be reaching. Extension ladders are a lot easier to set up, right? Make sure everybody knows the 4-to-1 rule as far as what that angle is supposed to be. You know, it's very easy to determine whether or not it's at that right angle. If you put your feet at the base of that ladder and extend your arms out straight, your fingertips should be touching that rung. That's, how people are engineered. They're at about a 4-to-1 when you do that. It sets up that right angle. So make sure that your employees know how to set that up. You need to be able to extend that 3 feet beyond a landing when you're transitioning from one surface to another. This is something we need to consider when we're determining what size ladder needs to go to the job, right? So if you're reaching a surface, if you're reaching something that's 24 foot or 20 foot to get to another surface and you send out a 24-foot ladder, it's not going to make it. I mean, it'll get them on, but it's not going to qualify for OSHA's requirements. It's not going to get that 4-to-1 angle and another 3 foot above it so that you can transition safely onto and off of that ladder, right? And it's a lot easier to climb onto a surface from a ladder than it is to climb onto a ladder from that upper surface, right? That's when you really need that extra 3 feet. So you can end up in a situation where your employee thinks it'll be fine, climbs onto that upper surface, and then while trying to get back onto the ladder is when we have that incident. If you have ladder in an area of high activity, make sure that they're tying it off, secure it, right? Or a barrier to redirect people around that area so it's not high traffic, and always block doors if you're setting up a ladder on the other side of it. I'd suggest locking doors or keeping doors open and then blocking them. Because, much like wet paint signs, people don't pay attention to barricades and say you can't go through this door, right? You can't trust people to follow rules to protect your safety. You need to make sure that your people in the field are aware of that, right? When you see it, enforce it. Okay, so as far as going up and down the ladder, this can be a real issue in the finishing trades. Most trades have a nice tool belt that carries all their tools, right? They can put them in there without a problem. I have not yet found a tool belt for a cut pot, right? I haven't found a tool belt for a 5-gallon bucket. So what OSHA says is that when you're ascending and descending the ladder, you have to face the ladder. Okay, pretty easy, straightforward, no problem. You have to use 3 points of 3 points of contact while going up and down a ladder. Ascending or descending is 3 points of contact. That's pretty easy to do. And you should not carry an object or load that could cause the employee to lose balance and fall. So what's the definition of a tool that could cause you to lose your balance and fall? Well, I think OSHA's argument would be if you fell off that ladder and you had a tool, that tool caused you to lose your balance and fall off the ladder, right? So should we be carrying up a cut pot on a extension ladder while we're doing the work? If we can use our full hand to grab onto the ladder while we're going up, yes, right? And that really just changes how we grab our cut pot. I found that if I hook it onto my outside of my thumb with my pot hanging on the outside, I could still climb a ladder and still have a full grasp, right? So some of this is technique, but we need to make sure that our painters are aware of how to do that. How about with a 5-gallon bucket? How do you climb a ladder with a 5-gallon bucket in one hand? Anybody have a good answer to that? Arnold, you've been around. What do you think is a good trick for it?
You can't.
Jessica,
well, you can if you don't comply with OSHA because you cannot have a 3-point contact. You know, but that's not to say it's not done. Normally what you do is you're supposed to do is basically put a rope around what you're going to hang up. And okay, I don't really mind if a person carries one end of the rope up with them so much. Yep. You know, so most people can carry a rope, you know, not a inch diameter rope type of thing, but that most people can carry that in their hand as they climb, and then they can pull up the bucket if they want to. Do people do that? Are they supposed to do it? Yes. You know, when they, you know, people want to save time, that type of thing. A lot of times you can save, you can do things the right way and the safe way, or you can redo them when you have an accident. If you don't have enough time to do it the right way, how are you going to have time to do all the accident investigation?
Yep, and I agree with both Jessica and Arnold. You aren't allowed to carry a 5-gallon bucket up a ladder, right? I mean, it could cause you to lose your balance. Cut pot is arguable. 5-gallon bucket is not, right? And pulling it up with a line is the best way to do so. Is that what we're seeing in the field?
Not.
I never saw it in the field, nor did I ever perform it that way when I was in the field. Yeah, I tell you the truth. That wasn't the way I did it. But that is what OSHA says we should be doing. So my next question is, you know, how do we enforce that if we want them to change?
I would say one way is to, for one thing, make sure they have the rope or some line to be able to pull the pot up or pull the 5-gallon bucket up. But even with that, that is an extreme strain on a person to pull a 5-gallon bucket of paint up by themselves you could really hurt a person or pull, especially if they got it about halfway up and all of a sudden they lost balance and they go down and meet the 5-gallon bucket halfway down. In other words, there is a joke thing about a guy hauling bricks down from trying to haul them up and something like that, and he has a problem, and the rope goes down, he meets the bucket of bricks coming up, boom, 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 boom type of thing. In other words, you don't want the 5-gallon bucket of paint pulling you off the roof.
Yep.
Right.
And that's a real consideration when you're talking about material movement up ladders. It's really challenging to determine that that's how we're going to move 5-gallon buckets of paint. Right?
All in all, it's better to have one of those forklifts that
a low rough terrain forklift as the extendable boom.
The extendable boom where it can haul it up and push it over, and then you unload it and then it goes down. Even but hauling a 5 gallons of paint is not light.
No.
So if you're using it by rope and you get it about halfway up and it starts sliding in your hands, you better hope that rope is not wrapped around your ankle as you lose control of it.
So, I think Arnold brings up some really good points about, the hazard of using rope to carry up buckets of paint, right?
I would recommend a pulley if you're going to do something like that.
Pulley is always going to reduce the resistance by half. That's always helpful. But in order to really use a pulley, you need to make sure that you have a system for hoisting, right?
Yeah, tripod type of thing.
When we have jobs where we're going to need to move material onto a roof or onto an area that's not accessible by anything but ladder, you need to make sure you consider that at the bidding stage, right? That may require an aerial lift to get material up there, or perhaps the general contractor has the equipment to a lull or rough terrain forklift to be able to put that equipment up there. But sometimes in order to support your employees following the rules, we need to do some pre-planning to make that happen, right? Because in the field, I imagine most of your foremen say we have to get that job done, right? And oftentimes as employers, we reinforce that when we should be saying the job needs to be done safely. And if we can't do it safely, we need to call and find out a good solution, even if it puts us behind, right? All right. So next, let's talk about issues that OSHA does call out on right citations too for ladders. Standing on the top step or the top cap. This is pretty common. I see it all the time when I'm out specking jobs. That top cap and the top step below that top cap aren't to be used as steps, right? Reaching outside the ladder rails, make sure that your employees are trained. Keep their belt buckle in between the rails of that ladder. Because if you're not keeping your belt buckle in between, you're likely to pull that ladder over to one side or the other. Right? A ladder is not a plank. Right? Don't use that ladder as a horizontal surface to stand on. Fall protection is required when the worker is exposed to a fall greater than the ladder. Okay, so normally you do not require fall protection when on a ladder. When climbing up a ladder, 3 points of contact, and you have administrative controls, right? We have a procedure, how we follow, and that is your fall protection for ladders. However, if you're exposed to a fall greater than the ladder, i.e. you have a ladder in a stairwell that has an exposure of falling over the rail down to a lower level. When you have that exposure to fall beyond the level of that ladder, OSHA requires fall protection. And then, you know, probably the easiest one for them to see is the ladder not extended 3 foot beyond the upper surface when used to transition, right? As a safety guy, that's like low-hanging fruit for me. I see that all day long, and I get to, you know, make sure I point it out to my clients. That's easy money for Mike. It's also easy money for OSHA. So let's make sure that we always provide the right ladders that are long enough to transition to that other surface.
I also want to mention one thing, if I can, is you very seldom mention it, or it's never really mentioned very much, but you should be facing the ladder, never back down the ladder.
Yep. Always facing the ladder while ascending and descending needs to be done, right? And, you know, once you're at your working position, OSHA doesn't say you have to face the ladder. Face the ladder. Really, that's where you have the best control. 3 points of contact, you always want to maintain while you're going up and down that ladder. It doesn't say that you need to maintain 3 points of contact while at your working position. It would be challenging to hold a cut pot and cut using that. But I always say use that third point of contact being your torso leaning against the ladder at that point in time, right? Don't carry some common sense for ladders. Don't carry the tools or material up and down. The landing areas is a big issue, right? At the bottom of the ladder, it needs to be clear. At the top of the ladder, it needs to be clear, right? When we're transitioning on and off of ladders, we need to make sure our housekeeping is good. We don't have things to trip on us. Keep your belt buckle inside not the rungs, but I just lost the name of those. So, you know, in between the uprights of the ladder, you got to make sure you stay within there. Job built ladders are acceptable, but they're only for access. You cannot use job built ladders to work off of. Right? Top cap's not a step. Make sure that it's level, right? Use your correct attachments on your different ladders to get that level. They do have attachments for ladders to allow that. Extend 3 feet beyond. Pay attention to the maximum loads and take those broken ladders out of service immediately.
Mike, one thing I don't know if you have available, but I've seen on a lot of job sites is the step-through ladders where basically the top 3 feet is just handrail. So when you put them up, you can step through, and therefore it's much easier to access when you're getting on the ladder to come back down where you don't have to swing across.
Yeah, that does make it a lot easier to transition into. And generally you'll have your job built ladders are almost always built that way. And there are those on the market that are available that you can get that way as well. And they're definitely valuable for getting the transition from one surface to another.
Okay, now let me ask you, I do have a question about that. If you have a step-through ladder, is the top rung a non-step service of that step-through ladder?
I would say for working, I'd say that the step-through ladder, I'm not sure. It really depends on how the manufacturer spells out its usage. To tell that OSHA doesn't have anything that specific in their regulations, and you'd really have to look at it a case-by-case basis for that ladder. Right? The manufacturer is going to specify how it's supposed to be used. If you use it in a method other than how they say, then you're taking it on yourself, right? Next issue we really need to consider with ladders is electrical, right? When we're using ladders outside, we need to make sure that we've considered overhead electrical, right? Always an issue. Consider the length of the ladder when you're considering that electrical. So we need to stay 10 feet away. So make sure that when you're bidding a job, if you have to use a 24-foot ladder to get to that, and the power lines are 18 feet away from that building, you have an issue, right? We need to consider, call out the utility companies, see if they'll blanket that, and make sure that we're not putting our employees in a situation where they have to fight a ladder near power lines, right? Overhead power lines are never insulated. Overhead power lines can reach out and shock you. Fiberglass ladders do conduct electricity when they have paint on them. And I imagine most of your ladders have paint on them. That gets rid of any protection from being conductive, right? Same with wooden ladders. If they have material on them, if they're wet, if they have paint on them, they now conduct electricity, right? Same with your extension poles. So make sure that you're taking that into consideration and that you're reaching out to the utility company when necessary. They generally will come out with a little bit of notice and protect those power lines, cover them with blankets so that you can lessen that hazard. Okay, so next let's talk about narrow frame scaffolds or bakers. These things are fantastic. I loved having them when I was out in the field, very useful. You can use them for material handling, moving material where you need it to, on top of being a good scaffold solution. Okay? The issue is, what I found is that there was a lot of surfing. It's a picture of me surfing when I was a little bit younger, although I may have looked a little more like the guy on the right. We cannot just shake our hips to move these along, okay? Very common practice, also pulling along by conduit up over our head. These are not acceptable measures. We can use something like the stop and lock here to make it so that our employees can't do that. But understand when we do that, we also lose the material handling function of this equipment. Because when we put a couple 5-gallon buckets of paint on top of it, now it won't move, right? So these can be very useful if you're having challenges with people surfing. But like I said, you lose that material handling aspect. Mini bakers have the same thing where they can also be surfed to get where you're going without coming down. Really, the way to stop this is by getting your foreman to stop it when they see it, right? Coaching your employees, using positive feedback when they're not doing it, and corrective action when they are, right? That's how you install that behavior change. You have to get your foreman behind stopping it. And that's the only way to really do it, is by constantly telling them surfing's not allowed, right? What we need to do is lock those wheels before we climb up so we can prevent that movement. So when we have baker scaffold that we build up higher, we are allowed to take them up higher, but employees cannot be on a moving scaffold unless the surface is level, right? The height to base ratio is 2:1, and you can't be outside of the base of the wheels. So as long as, you know, your bakers have 3 foot by 6 foot, usually 8 foot high. So you cannot have somebody pushing somebody else on a baker that's all the way up, right? Now we have fall protection requirements on our bakers, right? They are a scaffold. So scaffold fall protection requirements start at 10 foot. You can be up above that 6-foot standard height where most fall protection falls in construction when on a Baker scaffold, because a Baker is scaffolding, they have a different fall protection requirement. So 10 foot is where you're required to be have fall protection. Fall protection can take the form of what you see up here. This is generally what is used for fall protection on Bakers. They have a guardrail, mid-rail, and this one I don't see a toe board on, but they should have a toe board as well. Oh wait, no, I do see a toe board on there. So fall protection is required above that 10 foot. Make sure that you have your employees trained on your Bakers. Make sure they know how to use them. Make sure they know they're not allowed to surf, that they're not allowed to put other things on that platform to get more height, right? Can't stand on a bucket, can't set up an A-frame ladder. No pulling on things outside of that Baker to move, right? And that they're inspecting it like any other scaffold prior to use daily. Okay. You know, it's a scaffold, so you get to not be tied off until 10 feet, but you also are required to do your daily inspection. And I do suggest documentation of inspections of scaffolding. Stilts. Stilts can be very useful. OSHA, federal OSHA says that they're allowed. Some state-run programs do not allow stilts. I know Cal OSHA prohibits stilts from being used, right? So make sure if you're in a state-run OSHA program that you're aware that you check whether or not stilts are allowed before you utilize them. And if you are going to utilize stilts, use ones like on the bottom right, not ones like the guy in the picture there has, right? That's a do not strap buckets to your feet picture. Fall protection is not required on stilts unless you're exposed to a fall greater than that of the stilts themselves. So I find this a lot with tapers while they're working in the upper levels of in residential, where they're taping and they're right next to a railing that's put up for fall protection, but it's at normal height. If you're gonna have 36-inch stilts working there, you need to extend that fall protection up 36 inches, right? So make sure that you are protecting your stilt wearers from falls over that of the stilt itself, right? So guardrails sometimes do need to be raised. Do we have any other questions or any questions about ladders or stilts or scaffold or Bakers before we move on to hard hats? All right. So anytime you have workers working overhead, there's a requirement that you wear a hard hat, right? Now, whenever you have workers possibly working below, you need to put in a toe board and fall protection and all of that, but you also need to have hard hat protection. So if there's possible danger of head injury from impact, that's when the hard hat's needed. Generally, most construction jobs are going to require, a general contractor is going to require hard hats. But there's different types of hard hats, right? And we want to make sure we're using the right ones for what we're utilizing, right? A bump cap is not a hard hat. They're two different things. The type 1 protects from impacts to the top of the head, while type 2 protects from top and sides. Right? Then you have different conductivity of protection, electrical protection. So if you have interior painters, what is your electrical hazard? There's some, right? Depending on whether or not the electricians are energizing what they're doing. But for the most part, your interior painters, don't have to worry too much about their hard hat protection being non-conductive. But when we have exterior painters, it becomes more of an issue, right? So we want to make sure that our exterior painters have that Class E electrical hard hat that gives significant protection from electrical hazards, right? G is the general hard hat, and it has some electrical protection, and that's what most people should be using if they're interior, right? And then C is conductive. They don't provide any protection from electricity. If you're working in construction, you probably shouldn't have a type C. So next, let's talk about daily inspection. Now, if you look at your hard hat and it's got a Green Bay logo on it, it's a piece of garbage. Throw it out. Other than that, you need to inspect prior to wearing it, right? And make sure it's not damaged. You can't do that if it's covered in paint and you can't see the surface of the hard hat, right? So it's important that we either clean our hard hats or we're replacing them in a cycle well enough that we can still inspect our hard hats. It really depends on, the applications that we're doing. So, your spray guys, they might need hard hats replaced a lot more often, than the guys that are doing your trim, right? So it really depends on a task by task basis, but make sure you're looking at these hard hats periodically, right? How often do you see your guys in the fields hard hats? If you're not going out to the jobs to look at them, you're not going to see them, right? If you're not having them bring them in a periodic system, then you don't know when you see them next. Hard hats generally have a life expectancy of 5 years, right? But the support in it, that support harness needs to be replaced annually. So we have some FAQs I've heard from a lot of people on hard hats. I've been picking these up over the years. So here we go. Can a hard hat be worn backwards so that the brim's going the wrong way? Depends on the manufacturers. Some manufacturers say yes, some manufacturers say no. So you have to refer to the manufacturer on that. Can you replace just the support harness? Yes, you can replace the support harness, but the support harness has to be the same brand as the hard hat, right? So don't mix max brands as far as support harnesses and hard hats. Can you wear a bandana, hood, or skull cap under a hard hat? Yes. MSA says that's not a problem as long as it's worn smoothly on top of the head. Can a baseball cap be worn underneath a hard hat? They say no. I don't know what the difference is. Maybe it's that little button in the middle. You got me, but MSA says no ball caps underneath a hard hat. Can anything be placed in between the space of a hard hat and the harness? It's a great storage space for cigarettes. I used to like putting my iPad up in there so I could listen to it and nobody knew I was. You're not allowed to do that, right? Nothing in between the harness and the hard hat. It then becomes a method to cause an injury if you do have something like that. How about stickers on hard hats? Different manufacturers say different things about the stickers. Okay? They all generally agree that the stickers have to be a certain distance away from the edge. When I talked to a hard hat manufacturer, they told me that the reason for this distance has to do with the conductivity of the hard hat. In order to maintain that general conductivity rating, that G rating for a hard hat, some stickers have different metallics in them, which could make them conductive. So we need to make sure that those stickers are never, depending on the manufacturer, closer than 1/2 inch for MSA, 3/4 inch for Bullard, and North, the fiber helmets, they say, you can't put it on there. So we want to make sure that we can still assess those hard hats, that we can see if there's any damage to those hard hats. Yeah. Once a hard hat has taken a hard blow, it needs to be replaced, right? It's got a crack, it needs to be replaced. a lot of wear and tear, and needs to be replaced. And then 5 years is the outside of the life expectancy of a hard hat, and 1 year for that support harness. Is there any other questions?
Mike, what is the policy on people bringing their own hard hats?
Well, that depends for all PPE. Okay, I'm not going to just go to hard hats. I'll talk to all PPE on this. You are allowed to allow your employees to bring their own PPE, but you need to make sure that you assess it to determine whether it's good enough.
5 years.
Make sure how old it is, because there's a molded into the hard hat is a date stamp on it when it was manufactured. So that's not really an issue. But the same thing for gloves. I like these gloves. Well, if you require a cut protection level of 2 and they're bringing gloves that don't have it, then they can't use those gloves, right? So you need to make sure that you assess their PPE that they're bringing in. If they're bringing in alternative, that it is at least as good as the PPE you're providing.
And doesn't interfere. I mean, you can overprotect at a certain point.
Yeah, you want to make sure that it's still being utilized, but generally people that bring in their own PPE are pretty motivated to do so.
But with painters, if it's been inadvertently painted a lot from spray paint or whatever, that also affects the durability of the plastic, and
it does. And it impacts it, and especially when it hides those flaws. We need to make sure that we're cleaning our hard hats periodically so that we can see what the damage to it is.
Not with paint thinner.
Not with solvents that are going to degrade that plastic, right? And realistically, with paint that's dried on the hard hat, once we get enough on it, it needs to be replaced. I mean, realistically, I'd say an annual replacement on hard hats for a painting contractor would be a reasonable assumption. 5 years, I've never seen a painter's hard hat that's 5 years old that actually painted that could still see the hard hat. I've gone through a lot of them myself. And then never 5 years did it last. I spraying the trigger, pulling the trigger a lot, but it becomes an issue, right? So make sure that you're assessing those hard hats and that they're still up to snuff. Any other questions or observations? Anything to share? All right, well, we're getting to spring. A lot of those jobs are starting to kick off, especially those exterior jobs. So make sure that you're inspecting your ladders before you send them out, that you've considered the different sizes, right? We want to remove those barriers from people using the right ladders. One of those barriers may very well be the weight of the ladder or not having a selection to utilize. So let's make sure we make it as easy for our employees to comply as possible, because that way we make it the most likely that our employees will comply, right? All right. Well, with that, I'll hand it back to John. Thank you very much. And remember, if you have any questions, call the FCA Safety Helpline or email the FCA Safety Helpline. And generally, those end up on my desk. So you can get a good answer pretty quick.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank
Great
you.
stuff today, Mike.
Thanks.
Thank you all for participating, and have a great rest of your week.